and welcome to our SCUDEM 5 2020 Problem C presentation. My name is Gnagna Seck.
I'm Levav.
And I'm Brodsky.
And we are students at the University of Maryland, College Park. First, some background information. Uganda is estimated to have nearly 1.5 million refugees split between 11 main refugee camps. There are more than 60 South Sudanese ethnic groups, and groups of individuals come from shared backgrounds and enter at once. Refugees may often remain in camps for years and even decades. Our goal for this model was to model the evolution of preference towards different methods of conflict resolution in refugee camps. Some factors we considered are deferring initial preferences and willingness to adaptive groups, quantification of 3 models of conflict resolution, negotiation, mediation, and arbitration, social distance between individuals, presence of a hierarchy in the society of the camp, and influence of initial setup favored by the organizers. Some of our assumptions for refugee camps are: a refugee camp is approximately square, there is no internal migration within the camp, and population growth within the refugee camp is negligible. Some assumptions for influences are: the initial setup of the organizers influences every individual in the camp equally and does not change. Mediators and arbitrators are easily accessible and their beliefs are irrelevant. Physical distance is analogous to social distance, and social closeness equates to greater influence on one another. Here's our motivating perspective. Our basis for this model is based on social impact model in phase transition and social impact models of opinion formation. I sub I is the social impact on each individual in the refugee camps and is modeled by S sub I, which is the strength of one's influence, beta, the self-support parameter, sigma sub I, opinion of individual, H, the external influence, and G, D sub ij, which is a function of social distance.
So for the variables we used in our model, we assumed that the conflict resolution methods can be quantified neatly on a scale of a single variable formality. The self-support and the social status of an individual are quantifiable and are approximately constant, and the social hierarchy or the distribution of social status can be modeled using a triangular distribution. So in our model, an individual I has the traits F sub I, formality preference, beta sub I, self-support, S sub I, social status, and a tuple X sub I, Y sub I, location. We store the Pythagorean distance between individuals I and j in the variable d sub ij, and the social influence on an individual in big I sub I. The initial formality setup of the camp is represented by H, and the amount of influence that initial setup has is represented by eta. So all of these variables are essentially abstract, meaning they don't represent physical quantities in the real world, and thus we can't assign them actual units. There are several differences between our model and the model we're basing our model off of. For example, the initial model uses a binary value to represent the stance of an individual. It's either -1 or +1. In contrast, our model uses continuous value to represent formality preference. Also, we regularize all of the values to be between 0 and 1. This requires us to make several changes to our model, displayed on screen. So this is the update model we use. In essence, we just say that the change in the formality of an individual is equal to the social impact on that individual.
So then we also had to model the incoming groups into the camp. So how we did this was that for each group, we assigned a random central formality and self-support value. And then we used a truncated normal distribution to assign values to the individuals of that group. So they would stay between 0 and 1. And then we also picked a value from a triangular distribution, which represented our social hierarchy to get the social status of each individual. And we distributed individuals around a center point chosen to be the location of that group, also using a normal distribution. So we needed to make some assumptions for this, which included that the members of a group share similar characteristics since they're coming from common background, and the individual's preferences can be estimated with that normal distribution around the group's central value. And we also said that it's fine to assume that the group's location in the camp is random and that the members will choose to cluster together near that location.
We simulated the social hierarchy within the groups using a triangular distribution, which is determined by the mode values, minimum values, and maximum values.
So for the computational side of things, we used MATLAB to generate that triangular distribution for the social hierarchy values. And then we mostly worked in Python where we generated groups and used Euler's method with time steps that we varied to see the different effects. But then we calculated and stored the number of people with each preference at each of those time steps. So we said for each person, if their chosen formality value is between 0 and 1/3 at that time step, they preferred negotiation. Then they preferred mediation if their preferred formality value is between 1/3 and 2/3. And otherwise, if it's greater than that, then we said they preferred arbitration. And what we did was we started with one group in the camp, and then every 20 time steps, which we also played with to see differences, we would introduce a new group.
Here is the MATLAB code for the triangular distribution of the strength of social impact.
And this is just some sample Python code showing how we generated members given the group size and the formality and self-support centers, as well as the location. So first what we did was we wanted to make a map of the camp so that at any time step, we could map out the formalities of people and groups at different points. So here the triangles represent the group centers, and the dots represent the individuals clustered pretty close to those centers. And the shade of color represents the level of formality, either of that group or of that individual. So when we first started working with this, our visualizations were having some issues in that they were very jagged. So our solution to that was using a smoothing mechanism, which took a window of 3 consecutive time points and averaged over that. So once we got that working, we tried some different tests. So when we had the incoming groups have very high formality and high self-support, so very low willingness to change, they eventually won over most of the camp, which is shown by the green line here. Then if we had the incoming groups have random values, both for formality and self-support, the camp had a significant tendency towards mediation, which is the orange line here. When we had high formality groups coming in at regular intervals, there's an interesting point here where that preference overwhelms the camp. So you can notice the smaller steps in the green line before then, where those groups are coming in, but they don't have a major effect until time 60. So we had another unexpected thing come up when we were looking at our model, which is that the first group tended to have a much stronger effect on the final camp preference than the later coming groups. So here we tested out by setting the first group to have a strong preference towards negotiation. And after that, as time went on, that continued to be the trend for the rest of the camp. So here we wanted to see what happened when we adjusted the influence of the organizer's initial setup, where we said the organizers preferred arbitration to be the system. And on the graph above, you can see that the camp tended towards mediation. But then when we played with making the initial setup have more of an influence, we can see that there's a delayed onset in the two bottom graphs where arbitration does become the preferred method, but only after some amount of time. So conclusions that we can draw from some of these tests were that without external influence, there was a strong tendency towards a single conflict resolution method, whichever one of the three it was, but most commonly towards mediation, which was the one in the middle. We found that the initial group had more influence than we expected, and that the influence of the organizer's system had delayed onset, which was more immediate when it had a greater effect. We also found that that initial setup did have long-term consequences, which was interesting. And we also noticed that the locations which we assigned to the individuals didn't seem to have as big of an effect.
So we also created a model for how conflicts would occur and be resolved between individuals, though we didn't have the time to create a computational representation of this. For this, we assumed that all conflicts can be reduced to conflicts between two individuals, where the chosen method between those individuals has a formality somewhere between their formality preferences, and individuals with a greater social status have more influence over the formality of the chosen method. So in order to decide when conflicts occur, we look at every individual set I and j, where the probability of conflict is equal to the equation on screen. So probability tapers off as distance increases, and it's proportional to the self-support of the individuals involved in the conflict. Then, in order to determine what methods used, we compute a weighted average of their formality preferences, where the weights are the social status. So the greater the social status of an individual, the closer the intended formality of the resolution method is to their resolution preference. So some of the strengths of our model are that it considers many different parameters, including social distance, the influence of the initial setup, the hierarchical structures of the refugee camps, among others. It also models conflict preference changes at an individual level instead of a group level, so it can account for variations in preference and adaptability between members in the same group. Since it has many parameters, it's also very flexible. It can be adapted for many different circumstances. However, since we do not track which group an individual belongs to, we can't differentiate between changes within members of a group and between members outside of a group. We also had to clamp formality and other variables between 0 and 1, so the model can't fully change the formality of an individual. In addition, formality preference isn't influenced by conflict prevalence or outcomes, And the output of a model that we made varies significantly depending on what time step we use.
Here are our references. And thank you for this wonderful opportunity, and thank you for your time.
Thank you.